Good afternoon, dear friends. We're happy to welcome you on January Expert Dialogues, and we're going to talk about global trends. And today, together with our guest, Dr. Parag Khanna, we're going to talk about globalization. Some say that globalization is already dead, and historically, we used to say that there are some borders, there are flags, countries, and all that. It's a political map. But what we see now, plenty of sanctions, tariffs, geopolitical conflicts, makes us think that globalization is actually dead. So Parag is a well-known thinker. He's an expert in this field. He knows it all about globalization, has substantial experience, and he has very interesting thoughts, so it will be interesting to hear them. But allow me to start with something else. I know, Parag, that you travel a lot. You have been everywhere, and you like to understand what is happening in the world. So perhaps you could recall something, a situation where you thought that the old world is gone, the new is here.
Well, thank you so much for having me here with you today. It's really a pleasure. I do have a couple of very specific memories about the transition between old and new orders from first-hand experience. And the first is, of course, unforgettable for anyone who is perhaps over the age of 45. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I know that depending on what side of the wall one was on, there will be very different interpretations of its significance. But for me, personally, I was there. My parents took me there just 1 month after it came down. So it was December of 1989, just shortly after the famous day, 9th of November, 1989. And I got to sit on the wall. I got to hammer at the wall myself. And of course, it taught me that many divisions are artificial, and that countries don't necessarily always fall apart. They can also grow together. Within 1 year, you had the reunification of Germany. Again, it means very different things on either side of the wall and in a certain distance from it. But living that taught me a great deal. I also come from a family that was divided by the partition of India and Pakistan. My father was born in Lahore, India. My wife was born in Lahore, Pakistan. To put it in perspective, the same city but two countries across a generation. So as you can see, my whole life has been shaped in many ways by thinking about geography, whether it's connected or divided. But I'll give one more example that I think many of your audience can relate to. It was the World Expo in the United Arab Emirates that was hosted originally in the year 2020, but because of the COVID pandemic, it was delayed. And of course, many tens of millions of people visited Dubai and Abu Dhabi for the first time. And what I noticed was that the officials of the government were very, very focused on greeting every delegation from every country all over the world. A small country was playing host to everyone, and despite their limited manpower or human capital, they went out of their way to turn it into a diplomatic convening, and they made 196 friends that year, if you think about it. Every country had a pavilion, a delegation, and the leadership of the country went and shook hands with everyone every day to welcome them, to host them for the 6-month period. And that kind of goodwill will last for a generation or perhaps even longer. So that to me was also a turning point when a country that was not a traditional leader stepped forward and was the real host of the world in a seamless, very, very positive way.
Well, you're talking about connectivity and relations between people. So in your works, you talk a lot about countries. Well, traditionally, as we traditionally understand it, they tend to turn into hubs, and connectivity starts to play a bigger role. So in our day's world, what's more important? Tech companies, cities, countries?
Well, the short answer is all of the above. And the longer answer is that it depends on where, and it's the layering of those. First of all, if we are not emotional, if we can be objective about the role of the state and countries, the fact is that in 1945 there were only 51 countries, and today there are 200. So not all states survive. The median state in the world, or let's say the average state, is relatively small, not as big as Russia. Russia is still the largest country in the whole world. Most countries are very small. The average population is only 10 million people of a country. And so countries depend on cities as much or more than cities depend on countries. There are cities today, think of Cairo, for example, or Istanbul, that have been around for many thousands of years. The empire or the state that governs them is very fluid and changing, but the city is a permanent unit. So cities, states, and of course, the degree, this has been the principal argument of my work, is that if you take a lens of physics and apply it to international politics or to geopolitics, you think differently about size. You think instead about mass and gravity. Right? So a country, for example, I was talking about the United Arab Emirates earlier, is very small in size, but has very strong mass and density, and it has a gravitational pull. A place like Singapore, where I live, also, as we say, punches above its weight, right? Very small in size, but very dense and therefore high in gravity. And those are the things that matter. And then if you are also host to important companies that are platforms, that are conduits of connectivity around the world, that matters. For example, Singapore has about 36 internet cables, fiber optic internet cables, connecting it to many other markets around the world. So it has that redundant capacity, high-speed internet connectivity. There are countries, as you know, that have one cable. If that cable is cut, they are disconnected from the world. The final thing I would say is that for a country to be powerful, it cannot have its key elements of power, the city, the federal government, the companies, pulling in different directions. The metaphor I always use is tug of war. The oldest sport in human history, team sport, is tug of war. If my country is a team and your country is a team, and my players are pulling in different directions, we will never win. And so the answer is all of those units have to collaborate within the country for the country to have a durable, influential role.
You said that all elements matter, but I have another question. In Russia, our government officials enjoy putting maps on the wall, political maps with different borders, different countries. A political map as we see it here in Russia, we see it through the borders of different countries. What kind of map would you recommend to put on the wall? For example, a government official or a head of a company. What one should put on the wall to have the right kind of view on the world?
Many people think of geography as primarily political geography, the geography of borders, the geography of division. I always speak of geography in the plural, geographies. We have the natural geography of our topography, of our natural resources. We have our political geography of borders. We have what's called functional geography of connections, infrastructure, transportation, energy, communications. And then, very importantly, we have the human geography, the distribution of people. So 4 layers of geography. So when I make a map of Russia, or I make a map of the world, I put all 4 layers together so that I can show a leader what part of your country is most connected to other parts, and as a whole, what are the invisible connectivities. Things like who are your tightest, most dense trade relationships, for example, financial relationships, data relationships. So there are visible aspects of connectivity and invisible aspects of connectivity. But truly we can visually represent all of these things through geographical tools. And in doing so, we educate leaders to think not just in terms of political space, but also functional space. And that is really one of the key transformations that globalization has imposed on the world, is that we think as much functionally as we do spatially.
Well, you said that countries, if they work together, they may get better results. Is my understanding correct that these ties have biggest risks? I mean, trading infrastructure, digital or power infrastructure, where's the highest risk?
It's a very good question. There are optimizations that countries rightly engage in because, again, most countries are relatively small. It doesn't make sense for every country in the world to have its own currency, for example, its own sovereign data infrastructure, things that they can't necessarily afford, maybe even their own armies. Think about it from the perspective, again, of this median country in the world that cannot afford to be autonomous, autarkic, self-sufficient. So we engage in the level of monetary policy, finance, capital flows, trade relationships, military alliances, people-to-people exchanges, educational partnerships. All of these things are very specific. So all of them can be risky. There are, for example, if you look at migration, let's take an anecdote. Indians have been going to the United States for a long time in very large numbers to study. But the Trump administration decided that it doesn't want to have as many Indians coming. So suddenly that's reduced. That was a risk, right? After generations. Now they have to divert and go elsewhere. So if you are a country, of course, if you've been sanctioned, then suddenly you're looking at new kinds of trade partnerships, right? So any connectivity can be a benefit, and it can also be a source of vulnerability. We're always calibrating each dimension and each range of partnerships. The only way to be truly resilient is to have diversification and to have optionality. And those are the things that countries are learning today, whether they are big countries or small countries. Diversification and optionality. And as you very well know, these are not just observations about geopolitics. These are actually mathematical principles and principles from physics and biology about what constitutes a resilient system. So I like to look at the world from inside out, each country.
So it's like an evolution of countries. So they're trying to be resilient in this race.
It is. And what's so interesting is that, as you said at the beginning, many people say globalization is dead, but the reason globalization always wins in cycles and cycles, small cycles and big cycles, is because even when we act selfishly, even when we build specific infrastructures and connections for our own benefit as one country, it actually adds up to a network of connections that many, many actors can use. So we don't intend for globalization to win, but globalization wins as the sum total of the capacity that we are building. And that's why we've had not just two waves of globalization. Many people speak about the 19th century as the first wave and late 20th century as the second wave. In reality, you can go back well over 1,000 years to trace how these waves and layers have continuously added on to each other for exactly this reason.
Well, there's one story that is very important for the world right now. That is development of digital platforms. And what we see, in fact, there's another dimension for cooperation. It lies in this field. And digital platforms can give a country quite a lot of opportunities, breakthrough. But at the same time, we have platform colonization. The country that possesses a platform may affect the other countries, for example, if they don't have sovereignty or solution. So what are your thoughts on that?
And this is very important because, in a way, we have to be careful about identifying a platform with a country, because we're also entering an age where some platforms are transcendent of geography. Those are known as meta-nationals. We are all familiar with the term multinational. A multinational company has a large home market and also has sales abroad through affiliates. A metanational is a platform that is stateless. We can see this in the history of commodities trading, connecting supply and demand, but not having one geographical locus or headquarters. We can see this with the shipping industry. Countries, entire ships are flagged in one country and owned in another country, and so forth. We see it with consultancy firms. They are also stateless. They have teams of people that operate and advise governments or corporate clients around the world. But where is their headquarters? Nobody knows. And now we have it with technology platforms, where they could potentially relocate their legal jurisdiction. It could be in the Caribbean, it could be in Ireland, it could be in the United States, it could be in the Middle East, but they are providing the platform service. And they don't represent a government, right? They negotiate against sometimes the government, as we see whether it's European companies or American companies or Chinese companies, what we see right now is that, yes, we know the origin of that company. Where was it born? Which laboratory? Which university? But today, they are trying very hard to be meta-nationals because they will profit only by being as global as possible and by going circumventing or evading or resisting the restrictions. And so we have to look one example at a time, to navigate how it will play out. As we know, TikTok is, of course, a standard app in China, but with a different algorithm. But now they've been forced to sell part of it for in order to retain business in the United States and have that set of tools have U.S. ownership. Things like that. You would think that the Western community might be more unified around these things, but the European Union makes more money off of putting fines and punishments on American tech companies than it does on taxation of them. So we don't have a clean landscape there. But one point I will make is, again, from the perspective of most countries, what they are looking for, because they cannot afford to have true digital sovereignty, is that they are looking to participate in or benefit from platforms that are fast, that are good, and that are cheap. And that is the competition for the rest of the world. Because to start from any level, even with the lower cost of AI generating tokens and so forth, still it makes more sense to leverage the constantly upgraded and evolving technology coming from the robust platforms for one's own benefit. And then again, you have to navigate the tension between, are you therefore a vassal of a tech company, or are you leveraging the latest technology to strengthen yourself? And that is the dynamic that is playing out right now all over the world.
Well, I think we could say that there are two types of conflicts that have to do with platforms. What you just mentioned, platforms are becoming so big that they're trying to go beyond the country and get rid of this control. So conflict number one, this is supranational platforms that are trying to compete with the government or are trying to avoid their effect or impact. And second time of conflict, one country has a platform, the other has a platform. And what we see in finance, it may be used as a weapon, or technological platforms may be used to put pressure on other countries. So perhaps one conflict or both, is it about the independence from government, or is it a conflict between governments and platforms are used as a weapon?
In reflecting on both of these situations and scenarios that you've described, the lesson that we're learning today that is universal is that whenever there is an effort or an attempt to weaponize a certain tool, the response by others, by the targets, is to democratize it. So we've seen that happen over decades. The OPEC oil cartel tried to weaponize its control over oil production in the 1970s. And so other countries, specifically the United States, decided to explore more for oil and gas, and now they produce as much as OPEC countries. Whenever there has been an attempt to control the semiconductor supply, what happens is that countries say, well, we cannot be hostage to one single point of failure. So we democratize the production of semiconductor components. Of course, we're seeing it with the United States dollar. When there's an effort to weaponize the US dollar, the response by other countries is to democratize the tools, the technological tools, central bank digital currencies, bridges across finance ministries, settlement in non-US dollar payment systems, and all of these things are happening. So there's a universal principle at play, which is that we always want to avoid a single point of failure. When there is weaponization, the response is democratization. And so we can already forecast when we're talking about technologies and attempting to control data, for example, the response will probably be that new standards will emerge that will allow for open access, open architecture to that data instead.
Well, you have absolutely rightfully said, there is this annexion, there's something in response to that. And I'm sure that there will be connectivity between countries, people and platforms, and this connectivity is going to be more sustainable. So back to cities. You spoke about the role of cities, and you spoke about talents, talented people. So what's going to happen in the upcoming decade? How can we attract talented people to the cities?
it's worth, in answering the question, it's worth reflecting first on the demographic points that you made earlier today. We are going to live through peak humanity, this moment that people thought would not come until 2080 or 2090 is instead going to happen much, much sooner. You said it exactly right earlier. Every time we look at demographic data, we are revising it earlier to the year at which we will reach peak humanity. And as you also know, most countries in the world are already there. They are already at their peak. China is declining, Japan is declining, Korea is declining, fertility rates are declining. Without immigration, our populations are mostly declining, except for just a couple of places, critical places, Africa, South Asia. But generally speaking, most of the world has already reached that peak humanity. And so, therefore, demographics and migration in tandem become a zero-sum game. One country's loss is another country's gain. And this has not been the case for centuries. And this is now, you could almost say, a permanent condition, because we cannot imagine fertility simply going back up again. Many countries have tried, they have failed. So we have rapid urbanization on the one hand, and we have peak humanity on the other hand. Now, if you take the global demographic stock of 8.5 billion people, soon 9 billion, as you said, 4.5 billion of them are young. About half, less than half of them are truly mobile, right? With the kind of passports and skills that make them attractive. So what's happening right now is that the countries that have productive, dynamic, thriving cities are competing for those 1.5 to 2 billion mobile young people who could be anywhere and who are following opportunity, quality of life, affordability, skills, good salary, lifestyle. That is actually the operational reality of the war for young talent today. And I have been sort of observing this for more than 10 years, looking at the behavior of young people and seeing where do they go, what are the common characteristics of the winning cities. And with the COVID experience, of course, it exploded this process, because suddenly, before COVID, there were only 4 or 5 countries that were actively trying to recruit digital nomads. Now 120 countries are trying to recruit digital nomads. So it's not a hypothetical question you are asking. It is actually the decisive factor in determining the winners and losers of the 21st century. You and I both study economic complexity and systems complexity. And so I get asked, well, what is the silver bullet? What is the one rule? I say, if I could take all the drivers, all the unknowns, all the uncertainties of the world, and still predict which countries will win or lose in the future, I can actually boil it down to exactly one thing. Is your country attracting or producing young people? If it is, that means that you're doing something right. And so I urge all countries to do the things that you need to do to attract that young talent.
You mentioned the problem of peak humanity, peak of population on our planet. And it's clear that, give or take, in the middle of the century, we will hit those peaks and will then decline. And in some countries, we already actively experiencing those declines. What would it mean for cities? Our population will be concentrating, as you think, in the limited number of cities, and other will be desolated. Or is it going to be something else?
Exactly. So as you pointed out, the time scale of infrastructure in major cities is meant to last for generations, but we are less than one generation away from no longer needing much of that infrastructure. So in economics, we will simply call those stranded assets. And the reality on the ground is much more devastating when you visit these ghost cities and so forth. Again, there isn't one universal answer, because in India, the population is still growing. If you went to India 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you would say it's a 2-city country. But now you have 9 major metropolitan centers. All of them are growing. All of them are attracting young people. All of them have economic diversification. In China, however, where you have about 30 or 35 major urban clusters, many of them have peaked. many of them will probably shrink because they've already reached the turning point where all of the rural population that will move into cities has mostly already moved into cities. There will be more, of course. I actually foresee that on a global level, within our lifetimes, almost 100% of humanity will live in a city, a medium to large size city. So the question is, how many of those do we need? Some may have 30 or 40 million people, others may be sustainable at 3 or 5 million people. But you can very, very easily animate and foresee that by 2050, almost, if we only have about 7.5, 8 billion people at that time, once the curve starts to bend, and we have about 250 to 300 major cities, and then maybe 1,000 more smaller ones, yes, all of humanity will be distributed primarily across those cities, and there will be a lot of places that have been abandoned. I call them vacant states, actually. And as you know, in international law, the definition of a state is that it must have a fixed resident population and it must have recognized borders. Again, in the next 10 or 20 years, there will be places that do not even meet the definition of a state because of these demographic changes, migratory changes, climate changes, and so forth.
That's true. You mentioned a very important point right now. We, as any macroeconomics and experts who looks at the global picture, would like to speak about medians, but the regional definitions will be really great. You were mentioning that in China, those key agglomerations, they are trying to go down, to decline already. And for example, in India, and I will keep citing this example, India in the nearest decades will have to build around 30, as I think, new cities like Moscow, for example. They need around 30 of such cities. It needed to cope with the level of urbanization, 30 to 40%, and bring it up to 60% at least, and have this transition. It's going to have a very large-scale construction process. So I believe India, Pakistan, Bangladesh is the region that for the recent decades will become the global driver of the whole global economy. And so that's true. Coming over to the next block of our questions. What advice could you give to the government? For one, governments, you can give one advice. For others, others. But what first and foremost in governments should be focused on in a new world?
Well, this is a time of such significant populism and volatility in domestic politics, and I think that the way in which that will correct or settle is when we have a new generation of technocratic leaders who can think in terms of complex systems, who can reconcile completing objectives, that focus on governance, not just on politics. People like yourself, actually, who I think are the kind of technocrat. Fortunately, Russia has you, but many countries are lacking people of that caliber. And I think that people will get frustrated with always having these back and forth flip-flopping political cycles and instead realize that what we need is to focus on governance. I call it the difference between administration and representation. We have in many societies, many democratic societies, far too much representation. Everyone is always representing in a lawyerly, legal, political way. Who is actually administering? And that is something that you should be able to measure. What is the actual tangible progress? I layer a philosophical concept on top of that, utilitarian administration. Are you achieving the greatest benefit for the largest number of people in your public? Are you elevating the status of the median citizen in your territory? We look very often to cities instead as role models rather than entire countries. In surveys that we have all over the world, mayors and governors are often more popular than federal leaders. It depends on where and if they're doing a good job. But I think that is a reminder that people think locally, they want to see local results, and that grand rhetoric is not enough to satisfy them. So I think that's one thing when I'm working with governments. The other is, what can you do to attract investment and attract talent? And those aren't always the same. But it is very important to be participating in the global economy because it stimulates competitiveness, as you know. When a country is autarkic, then it's you don't face those stimulating pressures. You're not necessarily importing the best technologies. You're not generating value-added goods and services and so forth. So I advise governments to focus on attracting investment and the talent picture. And if those things are done right, given again how many issues there are to consider, governance, investment, talent, these are the pillars, building blocks of being a stable node, whether a city or a nation, in a highly, highly complex world.
You just touched upon it, but it's a very important point, what deserves a separate talk. Is transformation of the governance system what is meant here. So the economy is changing. We're basically moving globally from the pure market economy to a platform-based economy that already works based on different principles and that requires the response from the governance system. What you mentioned, transition from the representation to active management and administration. And do you agree with the message that in the new world of technological platform, AI and big data, this global connectivity, the role of administration and governance in this process will be much more important than just representation?
Oh, absolutely. In some sense, there is a whole emerging literature and study on algorithmic governance, predictive governance. How can, again, we use metadata from business transactions, from citizen behavior, from consumer behavior to understand needs? How can we anticipate demand for infrastructure, for example, or public services, education, healthcare? AI and big data are helping us tremendously to do this anticipation so that we can do a better job of governance. And I think that this is one of the trends that, in different countries is picking up faster or slower. In your remarks, you mentioned, some developing countries are leapfrogging very successfully, and I think that is a very good sign. India, as you know, has the most advanced identification and digital payment systems in the world, as does China. They didn't have those before. Countries that have legacy architectures and incumbents and special interests that almost prevent progress are actually hindering their citizens' ability to participate with, again, low interest rates, low fees in the new digital economy. So the platforms can help individuals and communities, but they can also help the government to be much more efficient. And we need more efficient government, not only because we should embrace these technologies, but of course because of the fiscal crisis. The share of government expenditure of GDP can be anywhere in OECD countries and Russia as well, above 30%, sometimes close to 50%. That is simply too high. It is simply unsustainable given the tax base, given the demographics. So we are being handed right now an opportunity to use technology to radically improve the efficiency of government in ways that we have almost lost the will to imagine, and we better embrace it. But I cannot say that every country will. I'm looking at the countries that are doing it right, and I am applauding those countries and supporting those countries and encouraging the others to follow their lead.
And what countries do you think may try it, as you mentioned? What example can you give of the most correct behavior in the world?
Well, as you probably know, I am partial to Singapore because I live there. But it is, of course, academically as well, and in the policy world, a place that is admired for many of these reasons. And I can tell you from the inside, they're always experimenting. They're always learning. One of the important intellectual turns in governance is not only to evolve or try to improve on your own past experience. The best technocrats always study the rest of the world. They go on delegations, they look at the best practices, and they view governance as a menu. When I want to manage my pension system, what can I learn from the Dutch? When I want to manage healthcare efficiency, what can I learn from Singapore? When I want to look at the role of conscription and social cohesion, what can I learn from Switzerland? And so on and so on and so on. For every functional area of governance, there is a set of countries that are doing the right things. It involves legal reform, education, climate risk mitigation, all of these things, everything that a policymaker has to grapple with, there are lessons not just from yourself, of course, but from the rest of the world. So I think that Singapore became Singapore by learning from everyone else and amalgamating it. And it's so fun and inspiring to watch in real time. I've been going to the United Arab Emirates. Well, I grew up there as a child, but I've been going there a lot for the last 20 years and working with their government and explicitly engaging in benchmarking exercises. And for 20 years, they've been asking me, what can I learn to fix this, and this? And we'll look out at the world and pull in the best practices. And so today, for all of your viewers and listeners, people who know Dubai and Abu Dhabi very well, ask yourself, how did it get to be that way? By benchmarking, by learning. So this is an exciting time because we have total information transparency to some degree over what other countries are doing, even to the level of how they're thinking about technology and how to apply it for public benefit. And we can learn and adapt in real time.
So summing up, I will try to summarize and you will tell me whether you agree or disagree. An efficient state is a state that builds its platform of development based on the modern technological principles, use best practice of other countries for separate elements, and promotes very good in two key areas. The first is strengthening of connectivity to other economies to improve its efficiency and involving talents.
That would be at least half of it. And I think, as you know, governance is an art, not just a science. I try to make it as scientific as possible, in the spirit of Max Weber applied to the 21st century. But you and I know that politics cannot be eliminated and perhaps should not be eliminated. It is itself a form of dynamism, to have feedback loops, basically. Feedback loops are so important. It doesn't matter exactly what the regime type is. What matters is the principle of feedback loops so that we are always self-correcting. We have to manage endogenous, turbulence and uncertainty, and external, exogenous as well. So what you said is exactly right, and it's the scientific part, and then there's also the art of it as well. And I think, again, good leadership is bringing the science and the art together.
And now, there is a myth. Whether you agree or not, please tell me, that the world will split inevitably into two blocks. And this is key block will the US and China and everything in between. Do you agree or not? That's my first question. Whether you agree with this statement. And the second question is related to it in terms of businesses and companies. How companies can survive in the world when very often they are asked to take a side.
So I definitely believe it is a myth. It is very common to oversimplify and to argue that the world is being divided into two blocks and that it is a new Cold War. As you know very well, the differences between the previous Cold War and this Cold War are very significant, not least because of the degree of interpenetration between the US and China. Even when you account for the full hypothetical decoupling, you still have a strong degree of interdependence among them. Secondly, and this is even more important, in the spirit of this notion that what matters more than just an action is the reaction, this is the second part of your question. How are other countries and how are companies reacting to this supposed split? And the answer is not that they simply choose sides, because they've learned from the previous experience. They've learned from the colonial experience, they've learned from the Cold War experience, and they know that what they should do instead is not to align entirely with one or the other, because then you limit yourself, you limit your market. Instead, you practice multi-alignment. You try to play all sides. You fragment your business. You adopt to different rules. You form joint ventures and partnerships. You become a more meta-national type of entity. And that's what smart companies are doing, and that's what smart governments are doing as well, is saying, I want to be friends with everyone to benefit myself. I will not be a pawn in a new Cold War.
So in conclusion, let's go back to the most important level, a regular person level. So imagine we have a 35 years old. It doesn't matter where one lives, but for example, this is geopolitical, demographic, and other factors that affect one's life. So what would you tell this 35 years old? What piece of advice would you give? What one should focus on in order not to become a hostage of the changing world?
Well, first of all, there is a very good reason for that person to be optimistic about the future. And the reason is that there has perhaps never been a better time to be a millennial or Gen Z or Gen Alpha, so 35 or younger, so long as you are skilled and mobile, right? If you can go to where the action is, where the dynamism and innovation are, you are welcome there. The cities of the world never turn away talent. The cities of the world are always trying their very best to attract talent. So there's never been a better time in world history to be young, skilled, and mobile. So that's number one. So, but the final part of it, the mobility, right? Make yourself available to go where the opportunity is. Chase the opportunity. I think many of us grew up in a world where there was an assumption, maybe our parents' assumption, that you will be born and live and perhaps die in the same place. Also that you will inherit your identity, whether it is your communal, ethnic, religious, other forms of identity, your values from previous generations. Today, as you know, young people absorb values not just vertically from their elders, but horizontally from social media, from their peers. There is a global generational consciousness that has truly never existed before. And I don't say this as a liberal hyperbole. I say this as an observation of the impact that technology has had on sociology in the world today. This is not fantasy. This explains today's young people's behavior. They are so incredibly willing to get up and go. So I think that the marriage of those forces makes me optimistic for that young person.
And in conclusion, I have a last question for you. Well, let's say you were to voice only one thought, but to be heard by companies, people, and governments. What would it be? What would you like them to hear right here, right now?
Connectivity is destiny. Those are the three words that I perhaps use the most often. Connectivity is destiny. It is the driver of the fact that globalization always wins. It's because we always invest in connectivity. Let me remind everyone, if you go back 150,000 years, what are the two truths about the human species anthropologically? There's actually just two. Because we don't have common language, religion, philosophy, two things. We are mobile, we spread around, and we congregate in cities, we urbanize, and we build connections among those cities. Those are the two fundamental truths of our collective behavior. We've had many wars, we continue to have wars, we have divisions, we have tribalism, but the long arc of history is that we urbanize and we build connections among cities. And therefore, connectivity truly is destiny.
Right, thank you. But indeed for me, the main idea, everything is evolving. Even connectivity is going to the next level. And those who are trying to weaponize it, well, they're just pushing the world towards other connectivity. And this connectivity won't be gone. It will be key for the humankind. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Parag Khanna, for this dialogue. Thank you for making time. And thank you for participating in our expert dialogues here in Moscow. Thank you so much.